So we're going to manage our expectations for how far we got into this book. All right. Question. In 2015, how many of you were watching the news and saw images of unaccompanied child migrants arriving in the country? Yeah. How many of you, when you saw those images, thought that this was a new thing that was happening? Yeah. Okay. How many of you knew that this was part of a longer historical pattern? How many of you thought it went back to maybe the 80s? How many of you thought it went back further? Okay. Interesting. So for a lot of people in 2015, when more than 50,000 Central American miners undertook the perilous solo journey northward in the hopes of making a new life for themselves in the United States, this seemed like a new thing, a new and dramatic and distressing phenomenon. Children seeking safety, freedom, and opportunity on their own were apprehended at the border, incarcerated, and in many cases, summarily deported. Others were incarcerated in prison-like facilities that were designed for adults. Lawmakers, lobbyists, and children's advocates asserted that the United States should treat these minors, most of whom were of Central American origin, as refugees from violence and economic deprivation, that in addition to being refugees, also had a unique age-based claim on asylum. Opponents argued that the children represented an invasion of young deviants, criminals, and gangbangers who were drawn to the US by President Obama's overly generous immigration policy. And as an example of his overly generous immigration policy, they pointed to the 2012 DACA executive order that granted temporary residence permits to some undocumented youth. So in 2015, we've got a controversy raging between people who believed that these children should be admitted and protected and others who believed that they were a dangerous invasion. At that time, students from UCI, from what was then the undocumented student organization, Dreams at UCI, asked me as their faculty advisor to help them make sense of what was going on, and especially of the hostile reception that was being offered to this group of vulnerable children from a region that many of them called home or had family ties in. As a historian of immigration and of childhood, I felt a keen sense of obligation to provide them with real answers to their questions. The desire to fulfill that obligation to my students is what drove me to spend the next 6 years researching and writing the book that I'm going to talk to you about today, Suffer the Little Children, Child Migration, and the Geopolitics of Compassion in the United States. Sadly, as you know, the crisis of unaccompanied child migration that came to public awareness in 2015 has continued to escalate. And the struggle to determine the parameters under US law of unaccompanied children's rights has only intensified, in fact, since President Joe Biden took office in 2021. And since then, we've seen several new surges of unaccompanied Central American, Haitian, Venezuelan, and other migrant youth arriving at the border seeking asylum. However, this ongoing controversy over the US's legal and perhaps moral obligation to this vulnerable migrant population nonetheless fails to recognize that the recent phenomenon of unaccompanied child migration to the US, although unique in its recent intensity, is in fact not at all unprecedented. Children entering the United States alone without a parent or a responsible guardian, whether they themselves were bonded or enslaved or free, whether they came voluntarily or they were coerced, have been a large, although mostly invisible, immigrant population since the colonial period. In fact, our first unaccompanied minors were enslaved African youth, taken away from their parents and brought as property, as chattel, not as immigrants, as chattel, as property, to work on white plantations in the South. However, it's only on the eve of World War II that American government officials, humanitarian leaders, and the general public began to develop an understanding of unaccompanied child migrants as a distinct immigrant population. And it was only in this time period before World War II that we began to see a growing, if selective, concern with and for young people migrating alone. Now, despite the ubiquity of unaccompanied child migrants in US history, my book, Suffer the Little Children, is the first comprehensive historical overview of this phenomenon. It covers the period from 1930, which again is when the federal government first began to recognize that unaccompanied migrant children were a thing, until the present day. And the book asks a series of questions that bring together US immigration history, foreign policy history, and the history of childhood. The questions that I ask are as follows. Between the 1930s and the present day, in what ways have shifting international and domestic circumstances shaped how, when, and why specific groups of children have been admitted to the United States? How have the laws and policies and programs devised to admit and care for those children evolved over time? What key players have shaped the nation's response to the phenomenon of unaccompanied child migration? And how have the objectives and beliefs and strategies of those players changed over time? And then finally, more of a cultural historian's question: how have emerging notions of refugee and children's rights interacted with American understandings of race, class, religion, national origin, gender, and age, to influence which children have been admitted or denied asylum? So to begin answering these questions, I spent, as I mentioned, 6 years hunting down historical records across the nation, trying to find unaccompanied children in the archives dating back to the FDR era. These have included congressional records, State Department, Department of Justice, Department of Health, Education, and Welfare papers at the National Archives, the United States Office of Refugee Resettlement reports, as well as documents from the Eisenhower, Kennedy, and Ford presidential libraries. I also did a lot of research in the papers of religious as well as secular non-governmental organizations, including the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, Lutheran Relief Services, and other archives. I also used archives like the Southeast Asian Archive here at UCI. And finally, I looked at the few INS and DHS, Immigration and Naturalization Service, and Department of Homeland Security, records and publications that are available to the public. Spoiler alert, most of them are not. Read together, these sources reveal that from the 1930s until the present day, an extraordinarily wide range of organizations and actors, all of them motivated by very different values, beliefs, and interests, have played important roles in shaping our response to unaccompanied migrant children. And something interesting that I found is that our treatment of unaccompanied children over time evolved from what was at first a series of really improvised programs that were run by voluntary agencies, child-saving schemes that targeted specific groups of endangered foreign children, and evolved over time into a much more broadly conceived set of federal laws, policies, and programs regulating the treatment of what became two distinct categories of children. First, unaccompanied refugee minors, or URMs, and unauthorized alien children, UACs. And what was so fascinating to me about this is that by tracing the evolution of these programs from these voluntary improvised responses to the evolution of a federal government response that was consistent through law, policy, and implementation, I was able to see the American state expanding and evolving over time from the 1930s into the 1970s and 1980s. And this process of expansion of the state was happening at the same time that internationally, new ideas about refugees and children's rights were also emerging. Now, despite the fact that there were a lot of different actors and a lot of different interests involved in this process, and importantly, despite the fact that government and media discourses consistently insist that our response to refugee children has been motivated by humanitarian impulses, in my book I argue that the U.S.'s response to unaccompanied child migrants has been driven over time by what I call a geopolitics of compassion that selectively highlights U.S. benevolence towards suffering people outside the nation's borders while simultaneously prioritizing foreign policy and domestic political interests over asylum seekers' best interests. Now, in simple language, what am I trying to say here? I'm trying to say that although our government and our media strategically highlight their benevolence when they admit refugees and refugee children into the country, the actual decision-making calculus emerges from a consideration of what's going on in our foreign policy and what's going on in our domestic political context. Now, this isn't an entirely new idea when we talk about refugee policy in general. Scholars like Gil Loescher, John Scanlon, Carl Bontempo, Maria Cristina Garcia have shown that refugee policy has been historically linked to foreign policy. But up to date, no one has talked about the unique position of migrant children within this process of refugee policy formation. This is an important omission, I argue, given that since the 1930s, the admission of carefully selected groups of unaccompanied children has served a lot of policy purposes for our government. I argue in my book that it has provided successive administrations, both Democratic and Republican, with a relatively low-cost means of advancing some pretty crucial foreign policy goals. In many cases, unaccompanied refugee children have become a source of evocative public relations materials, as government officials and the U.S. media, at different moments in U.S. history, have sought to exploit the propaganda value of images of suffering children to either generate or signal their support for their allies during World War II, to discredit the USSR and project the US's image as a benevolent power, and to confirm the superiority of the American way of life during the Cold War and after. On the domestic front, a similar calculus has also operated. At different moments in history, the resettlement of unaccompanied minors has also advanced domestic political goals for different US leaders since FDR, since the 1930s. The admission of carefully selected groups of refugee children has served to placate powerful political, ethnic, religious, and humanitarian lobbies, demanding that the nation fulfill its moral ideals and its commitment to overseas allies by opening its arms to groups of suffering children who they argued were uniquely deserving of American protection. Now, who are these children, you might be wondering, right? Let's look at a few of the groups of children who have been selectively admitted as unaccompanied refugee minors in the service of some of these foreign policy and domestic political goals. On this page, there are two images for you. The large image, seated at the middle, are a Jewish American couple, Gilbert and Eleanor Krauss, who, after working with Jewish American allies in the early 1930s when Hitler came to power in Germany, worked together to beg the US government to admit Jews fleeing Nazi terror. Our government, like most governments around the world, largely closed the doors to Jews fleeing Nazi terror. However, through the advocacy of groups of Jewish Americans, they did provide a small number of visas for approximately 5,000 unaccompanied Jewish minor children who were brought to the US, where they were put in foster care, mostly with Jewish American families. 5,000. That might sound like a lot, but I want to remind you that 6 million people died in the Holocaust, and approximately half of those people were children, right? So clearly, we could make the argument that this was an insufficient humanitarian response, right? But this is Gilbert and Eleanor Krauss with some of the children whom they went to Germany to bring back, funding it themselves. There were no federal dollars spent to bring these children. On the other side of the slide is a poster advertising the work of an organization called the United States Committee for the Care of European Children that became active after 1940. Now, after Hitler invaded Poland and began expanding through Europe, and it became clear that eventually he would send his air force to attack Britain, the same folks in the United States who had opposed bringing Jewish German children to the United States became very concerned about what was going to happen to British children if there was an air war. And so there was a massive popular uprising of sympathy for British Protestant Christian children. And an organization, the United States Committee for the Care of European Children, building on the legal strategies developed by Jewish Americans, created an organization and petitioned for visas to bring British children to the US. Now, where Jewish Americans had met with basically closed doors pretty much the whole time that they'd been attempting to save Jewish children, USCOM, the committee that brought British children, had the doors open to them by the American government. And the process of bringing British children was facilitated by the federal government. So these are two groups of children that were brought in the 30s and 40s to the US. Moving on to some of the children that were brought during the Cold War. On the far right of the slide, you can see a young boy, a Cuban boy, who was brought to the United States in 1960 as part of a program that became known as Operation Peter Pan, and the Cuban Children's Program, as part of which 14,000 Cuban children were brought to the US and placed in now federally funded foster care in order to protect them from communist indoctrination in Cuba. The young woman in the other black and white image is also a Pedro Pan child who at the age of 17 was able to then petition to bring her Cuban parents to the United States. On the other side of the slide, you can see the images of some other anti-communist children, children fleeing other communist revolutions, whose treatment and reception was a little bit more ambivalent, right? The image at the bottom is from a group of Vietnamese, what were called at the time boat people, people who fled Vietnam aboard ships seeking asylum in Australia, in the United States, in France, in Canada. Many of them were unaccompanied children. Some began as unaccompanied children. In some cases, their parents or their caregivers died in the process of attempting to escape. Approximately 25,000 Vietnamese children, unaccompanied children, were admitted to the United States in the first few years after the end of the US war in Vietnam. In the 1980s, another group of Southeast Asian origin children, most of them mixed race, the children of Black and white service members who had had children with Southeast Asian women, also came to the United States. Many of them also came as unaccompanied, although in most cases their Vietnamese and Southeast Asian mothers were alive. But the US legislation that allowed them to come to the United States did not allow them to bring their mothers with them. So they were admitted because conceivably they were children of US service members, which in fact, under US law would normally make them citizens. But in this particular case, a piece of legislation, the Amerasian Homecoming Act, was passed, which allowed them to immigrate but not to bring their mothers. So it created an entire group of unaccompanied children, right? So these are some examples of different groups of unaccompanied minors who have come to the US. There have been others. Hungarian unaccompanied minors that came to the US after the failed 1956 uprising against the Soviet Union and Hungary. There were thousands of Hungarian children that came alone, mostly young boys. And then moving forward from the 1980s to present day, other groups of children have come. And we'll talk a little bit about them now. So all of these groups of children that I've shown you images of before 1980 were admitted to the US on a case-by-case basis, in the same way that refugees were admitted to the United States before 1980. Up until 1980, we had no comprehensive refugee law. Refugee admissions were done in response to emergencies and in response to particular crises, right? With the passage of the 1980 Refugee Act, the US government adopted for the first time universal criteria for the admission and resettlement of refugees. And this was the nation's first comprehensive legislation that dealt with refugees as a category, rather than on a case-by-case and emergency basis. It also finally brought the US in line with international law. Up until 1980, the US had refused to ratify the UN's definition of refugees as people who were fleeing with a well-founded fear of persecution, rather than people who were fleeing communism, which up until 1980 had been the basis for US definitions of refugees following World War II. The Refugee Act also, for the first time, created and funded a permanent resettlement program for unaccompanied refugee minors. Now, I want to just pause for a second and think about that, right? Around 1930, the US government and voluntary agencies have figured out that unaccompanied refugee children are coming to the United States. They've had multiple crisis situations with different groups of children, right? German and Polish Jewish children, British children, Hungarian children, Cuban children, Southeast Asian children. Finally, 50 years later, we pass a law that acknowledges that this is probably going to consistently be part of every refugee movement, and we should probably have a consistent program to deal with them, right? Okay, so this is a good thing, right? The Refugee Act represents the culmination of almost 50 years of humanitarian and political and legal activism. It also represented Americans' growing acceptance of new notions of refugee rights and of children's rights that were encoded in international law. But, and here's the big caveat, right? U.S. refugee law and the new program for unaccompanied refugee minors since 1980 say one thing on paper. In practice, I argue in my book that they continue to be powerfully influenced by the geopolitics of compassion, the calculus of what serves our foreign policy interests and what serves our domestic political considerations. This geopolitics of compassion has become increasingly apparent since the 1980s, which is a time when, as many of you know, hundreds of thousands of Central Americans fleeing brutal but US-aligned regimes, and this is a group that included thousands of children, minors, young men, who were seeking to escape forced conscription into Central American militaries and paramilitaries, were denied asylum in the United States. At the same time that Iranians and Jews fleeing the Soviet Union were admitted on consistently higher rates. The geopolitical basis of child refugee admissions was equally apparent during the 1990s, when US concerns for the growing security threats emerging in East Africa, as well as transnational celebrity activism on behalf of child soldiers on the continent, led to the admission of a growing number of URMs who were former child soldiers from Africa. At the same time as Central American migrant youth fleeing forced conscription continued to be denied asylum. During the 2000s, changing geopolitical and domestic political considerations have contributed to further diversifying who is among the unaccompanied refugee minor population. Our URM program now serves children, refugees, asylees, victims of trafficking and abuse from almost 50 nations. However, the geopolitics of compassion continues to operate, particularly in terms of the federal government's hardline posture towards growing numbers of Haitian, Mexican, and Central American children who continue to flee economic deprivation and state-sponsored violence in their homelands. Since the 1980s, and this is despite sustained advocacy by legal and religious and grassroots organizations, the US government's failure to acknowledge the human rights violations of anti-communist allies and its disavowal of the devastating consequences of a century of US interventions in Latin America and the Caribbean has led to a systematic denial of asylum to unaccompanied minors from south of our border. At the same time, mounting anti-immigrant, anti-refugee, and anti-Latino sentiment, which has been fueled by surging unauthorized immigration from Mexico, has also fueled racialized hostility towards asylum seekers from south of the border. What this has meant is that the intertwined foreign policy context and the domestic political context since the 1980s has shaped the reception of the mostly poor and non-white minors who have been arriving since 1980, most of whom come now from south of our US border, and most of whom continue to be treated as illegal immigrants and as illegitimate asylum seekers rather than children in need of protection. So I want to tell you a little bit about who I'm arguing with in this book, right? Because scholars, we don't write in a vacuum. We write in response to what's already been written, either to reinforce it or to challenge it, right? So theoretically, I owe a lot of my thinking to a new field, an emerging multidisciplinary field called critical refugee studies. And in particular, to the matriarch of this discipline, Yenli Espiritu, who is a professor at UCSD. And in her book, Body Counts, The Vietnam War and Militarized Refuge, Yenli Espiritu was the first one to argue that refugees, rather than a problem that countries need to solve, are often a solution that they are tools of statecraft through which nations solve particular foreign policy and domestic political problems, right? So I build on this idea that comes from Yenli Espiritu's work, but my analysis keeps at the front of our mind the unique way that migrant children play into this. Oh, sorry. But while I dialogue with critical refugee studies and with Yenli Espiritu's work, I also help to build theory in this field, right? And one of the ways that I do this is by asking a question about the extent to which different groups of unaccompanied child migrants since the 1930s have been understood as individual rights-bearing subjects. Do children have individual human rights? I argue in my book that, like women before them, children have been considered as possessions or as appendages of adults. In the United States, in our immigration law, children went unrecognized as individual subjects of immigration law. They didn't exist in immigration law until 1907, when children's admission without a parent or a guardian was formally prohibited. Although in practice, they kind of left it up to the border guards at Ellis Island, at Angel Island, to decide if a kid was old enough to come in on their own, right? By the time the 1980 Refugee Act was passed, US immigration law had dramatically transformed and included a number of provisions explicitly recognizing that children had unique age-based interests and needs. However, in my book, I argue that the decisions about which unaccompanied children to admit or to exclude have historically been based on an understanding of children as extensions of their parents or their communities. Now, what does this mean? What are the consequences of this? This implicit denial of children's individual existence has meant that some children, mostly white, middle class, European origin, or Christian children, have been favored for admission when Americans wish to demonstrate solidarity or provide assistance to their parents or to their home nations. So in 1940, when Americans were deeply concerned that Britain was being attacked by Germany, and they were frustrated that the US government was remaining neutral in World War II, the act of offering admission and sheltering, fostering a British child, became a way of demonstrating solidarity for British parents or for the British nation, right? But this understanding of children as appendages of their families, of their parents, has worked against poor, non-white, and non-Christian children whose claims on admission and asylum have often been evaluated in light of their broader implications for refugee and immigrant flows from their homelands. Meaning what? Meaning that rather than evaluating their case for asylum based on their own circumstances, part of the logic has been, if we admit these children, what's it going to mean for migratory flows from people of their background that are adults, right? So this racialized logic meant that many of the endangered Jewish children who people tried to bring to the United States in the 1930s were barred because American legislators feared that they would become an entering wedge. And these are words from the congressional record. They would become an entering wedge that would force open the doors to adult refugees, to their parents, as time went by. This idea, this racialized idea of children as an appendage, also enforced laws that forced a group of children known as half orphans, European children after World War II who had lost one parent but still had a living parent, to be eligible for admission to the US as refugees, but only if they left the living parent behind, right? Similarly, the children of American GIs and Southeast Asian mothers in the 1980s admitted, but only if they agreed to leave the parent behind, effectively forcing these children to choose between a life of deprivation or to migrate alone. Between the 1970s and the present day, this racialized logic has also inspired a growing number of frontline immigration officials to make decisions. And remember, that's where immigration admission decisions are made, even today, by frontline agents, and they can't be challenged. This logic of the concern of children as appendages who will open the door to people from their communities has inspired many immigration officials to undercut Southeast Asian, Haitian, Central American, and Mexican minors' access to asylum, even when there was indisputable evidence of their acute need for protection, because of the fear that they would become anchors. How many of you have heard the term anchor baby? Right. So this is part of this logic of the child as not an individual who possesses their own rights, but as an appendage, right? So in all of these ways, I build on and I build theory for the field of critical refugee studies. With that being said, though, I diverge from the field of critical refugee studies, as well as from the field of childhood studies, in one really big way. Both of these fields emphasize the need to tell refugees' stories in their own perspective and in their own voices, to tell children's stories through their own perspectives and their own voices, and to emphasize that both refugees and children, although they have been historically framed as dependent and passive, are in fact agents who can make strategic choices and act on their own behalves, right? And these are important priorities that the field of critical refugee studies and the field of childhood studies offer us. Despite this, in my own work, I unapologetically center the state in my analysis. So this is the main way that I diverge from these fields. And I do this on purpose, right? To be clear, I see refugees and children as agents, as strategic and creative and resilient actors who possess and produce knowledge. But I made the choice in this book to focus on the formation and implementation of refugee and resettlement law and policy, because let's be real here. If you have ever been displaced or you have ever crossed a border, you know that the state exists and that the state shapes people's lives, right? I think it's important for those of us in the fields of critical refugee studies and childhood studies, despite our theoretical commitments to children's agency and to refugees' agency, to still recognize the predominant role that the state plays in shaping the lives of forced migrants of all ages, right? And perhaps especially the lives of children who have been denied state-administered rights and benefits in their homelands, and so then seek them by crossing borders. So through this focus on the state, I am attempting to shine what I think is maybe a harsh but necessary light on the different treatment of similarly endangered groups of unaccompanied migrants in US history. So one of the main things that I was attempting to do in this book was to challenge the depoliticizing humanitarian discourse through which a lot of Americans understand refugee policy and particularly unaccompanied migrant children, right? I argue that we need to look at specifically the contexts that produce refugee and migrant children, what role our foreign policy has played in creating that displacement, and then as well the foreign policy, geopolitical, and domestic political contexts that shape who gets admitted and who doesn't get admitted, right? And at a time when public attention is still focused on this pressing issue, my hope is that this book will inspire people to think critically about our refugee policy and perhaps have a more informed and compassionate discussion about what would be an appropriate policy response to this uniquely vulnerable migrant population. I think we can all agree that our immigration and refugee policy is broken, right? How to fix it? There's room for reasonable, educated people to disagree, right? But we first have to look in a clear-eyed way at what has motivated our refugee and immigration policy in the past and acknowledge that it has not always been humanitarianism, right? So in closing, I want to share a personal reflection about the meaning of the book's title, which many of you may know refers to a moment recounted in the Gospel according to St. Matthew, where if you are familiar with the Christian tradition, you will know that Jesus was teaching to a crowd, and a bunch of kids came up to him, mobbed him the way that kids do, asking for his blessing. And Jesus' disciples chased the kids away, said, "Go away, kids. You're bothering the man," right? Jesus chastised his disciples for doing this. And in the King James version of this story, Jesus said, and I quote, "Suffer or allow, permit the little children, and forbid them not to come unto me, for of such is the kingdom of heaven." Now, there's lots of different theological and spiritual interpretations that you can make of that text depending on your worldview and your beliefs or lack of them, right? But for me, as a feminist and a social justice-minded Catholic, as well as a migrant rights activist, the meaning of this scripture from the Christian tradition is clear. Children, regardless of their origin, their identity, their race, their religion, their gender, their sexuality, their citizenship status, are important members of society in their own right. They are individual possessors of human rights, not appendages of other people. And they are equally, if not more, entitled to care and compassion. And when they, like refugees of all ages, are compelled to flee their homes in search of safety, they should be welcomed and cherished. And so, as Christ, who was himself once a refugee, reminded us, our collective future is in the hands of these children, right? So I will stop there and thank you for listening to a very dense and theoretical talk, and hopefully take some questions.